Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 309. Podcasts are oral Torah. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are continuing our mini-series. This is the second of two episodes, introducing you to some awesome new podcasts in the Jewish ecosystem. Last week, we interviewed Joshua Molina and Shira Stutman about their new podcast, Chutzpod. And today we are interviewing the host of a podcast that's been out a while and now has started its second season. That podcast is called Pod Drosh, and our guest today is actually a returning guest, Leon Wiener Dow. He was our guest on episode 164 when we talked about his book, The Going, and if you're interested in that, you can check out episode 164. Now, before we get into this week's episode, I want to announce that we have now opened registration for the second semester of classes in the new Yeshiva, our Center for Jewish Learning and Unlearning. We are now expanding our faculty by 2, and we hope to expand it by more than 2 in the years ahead. We're going to be offering 4 courses this spring, and you can register now. The courses are going to start in the second half of February. So if you're interested, check it out now at unyeshiva.com or just go to the judaismunbound.com website and click on the Unyeshiva logo in the middle and it'll take you there. And you'll be able to see the 4 classes we are offering. Now, our 2 previous Judaism Unbound guests who are going to be teaching this semester are Kashira Halev Fife, who was our guest on episode number 246. She is the executive director of Kohenet, among other things, and she is going to be teaching a class called Shemitah, Putting Ourselves in the Practice, which, as you can imagine, has to do with the Shemitah, this year of sabbatical, this year of rest and release, which is going to be fantastic. Our second new teacher is Tova Birnbaum. She is the director of Jewish content at our old friends, the Oshman family JCC of Palo Alto, California. And she is going to be teaching a class called Being a Secular Jew, Concepts, Practice, and Possibilities. Now, if you remember about Tova, she actually grew up ultra-Orthodox and now identifies as a secular Jew. And she is somebody who has thought long and hard and in fascinating ways about bringing real deep meaning to the idea of being a secular Jew. Now, I'm going to be teaching a class again, of course. It's called Unreliable Sources, What Jewish Texts Really Say About Holidays and Practices. You can imagine what that's about. We're going to look at literally everything the Torah has to say about the Jewish holidays. And spoiler alert, it's not that much. That's why we can fairly say we're going to look at everything. So we're going to really explore all of that, and hopefully it'll give you a lot of oomph in terms of reimagining some of your own practice. And finally, and connected to today's episode, Lex is going to be teaching a class called This Too is Torah, Finding Jewish Wisdom in Unexpected Places, where Lex is going to be exploring all kinds of sources that we could fairly call Torah, whether those are Jewish sources, sort of Jewish sources like a Jewish TV show or a TV show on a Jewish theme, or sources that people don't think of as Jewish, like sports, and everything in between. If you want to check out any of these and learn more, there's some writing about each of the courses to explain what it's all about. You can just, again, go to unyeshiva.com, and hopefully you'll want to participate. And on this topic of This Too is Torah is really the hook to bring us into today's episode with Leon Wiener Dow. His relatively new podcast called Pod Drosh. Drosh is a word that means something like interpretation. And this is a podcast that actually listens to other podcasts and discusses what really important principles, Jewish principles and more general principles, come out of a real analysis and a real grappling with stories and cases that come up on other podcasts. And in that sense, Podrash is treating podcasts as a text, as a source of Torah, oral Torah. It's a fascinating podcast. Each week, there is a guest who is a rabbi or a Jewish thinker of some kind. And each week, there's also a guest who is not a Jewish professional who is bringing some kind of expertise from their own work outside of Judaism to the topic at hand. So let me just say a few brief words of welcome to our guest because he's been a guest before. But Leon Wiener Dow is a rabbi, a scholar of Judaic studies, an educator, and a writer. He is the head of the Beit Midrash, the study hall at Kolot, an organization that works through study to, quote, create waves of change in Israeli society and beyond. He also teaches at Binaz Secular Yeshiva in Tel Aviv. Leon Wiener Dow has a PhD in philosophy from Bar-Ilan University and rabbinic ordination from David Hartman of blessed memory, the founder and head of the Shalom Hartman Institute. Leon Wiener Dow is the author of 2 books, The Hebrew Uvelechtecha Vaderech, which constructs an approach to halacha based on the thought of Franz Rosenzweig, and The Going, a meditation on Jewish law, which won the 2018 National Jewish Book Award in the area of contemporary Jewish life and practice, and that we discussed on Judaism Unbound. So without further ado, Leon Wiener Dow, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you back.
Thanks, Dan and Lex. It's great to be here.
So I thought we could get started. We've given a little bit of an introduction to your podcast in the intro, but can you walk us through the structure of your podcast and why it's structured that way? Because I think it is a structure of a podcast that I haven't encountered before.
Yes, well, the structure is Talmudic, by which I mean there's lots of scaffolding. I would say at some level, theoretically speaking, it begins with the text. And when I say theoretically speaking, I'll say kind of at the end why it doesn't actually begin with the text. But really what we're beginning with is a podcast, a different podcast, a quote unquote non-Jewish podcast. And it could be This American Life. It could be Heavyweight. It could be Radio Lab. It could be any number of podcasts. And we take little snippets of that particular episode, and those become the kind of text that we're then going to drash, that we're going to then expound upon. And so the first few minutes, usually about 5 or so minutes of the podcast, is an introduction to the text for the day. Following that is what we call the context, which is a conversation between some leading light in American Jewry, some significant or interesting voice, usually of the rabbinic type. And the main point of that 20 or so minutes is to hear that person, that guest, number one, react to the podcast, to that text, and then number two, frame it Jewishly, and usually through the lens of a particular Jewish text that came to mind to this person. The third part, which we call the hypertext, is a slightly shorter conversation around 15 minutes of someone who comes from a totally different walk of life, someone who's Jewish usually, and who brings some kind of professional tools to bear on the same topic that we're discussing. And then at the end, I kind of try to bring things together. Now, the one piece that I didn't mention, which is actually the first segment of the entire podcast, is a short excerpt from an extended study session that I had with my chavruta, my study partner, Rabbi Joel Levy, where we were studying the text that our main guest brought. And there's just some little snippet, some little gloss that I take out of what he said, and which does end up becoming a significant part of the conversation, but you really only kind of get it at the end. Meaning, I hope that it's kind of enticing to the listener already from the beginning, but in terms of really doing something with it, that really only comes together at the end. That's how more or less every episode is structured.
So, okay, I want to get behind why the structure is that way or what you're trying to do, because I'm kind of thinking about it in one of two ways, and maybe it's both, and maybe it's something completely different. One is to look at the podcast itself, meaning the non-Jewish podcast that we're talking about, as a significant source of wisdom, learning, thought in its own right, such as we are used to thinking in the Jewish world that that's the role of Torah or Talmud or something. And what you're really saying is that is too limiting of a frame, that Judaism is too limited if it thinks that the only sources of wisdom are the holy books of Judaism. And so this is a way of expanding that. Or one of the things that you do on the podcast, or let's say the first thing that you do before you get to the person who's bringing an extra Jewish source of experience, but the first thing you're doing is having somebody bring Jewish wisdom into conversation with that initial text. And I'm wondering if what it's really about is saying that, no, the Jewish wisdom really is kind of sufficient and is really what we need. It's just that for some reason people are not applying it to their lives in the more, quote, secular dimensions. So by using Jewish wisdom to interpret a podcast, what you're really saying is Jewish wisdom is relevant to everything, and that's the real goal of the podcast.
There's a well-known quote of Rabbi Yishmael, the early rabbinic sage, who said his students asked him, well, when are we allowed to learn Greek wisdom? And Rabbi Yishmael says, it says in the Torah that you're supposed to think about it, V'agita bo yomam v'layla. You're supposed to think about Torah and meditate upon it day and night. So he says to his students, find me a time that's not day or not night. That's when you can learn Greek wisdom, right? and of course, Rabbi Yishmael is extreme, and he's trying to kind of create a very, very insular sense of Torah. And his students are knocking on his door and saying, but wait a second, there is a lot of wisdom out there. There is such a thing as chokhmah yavanit, as Greek wisdom. The Torah is not the only source of knowledge and understanding and wisdom in this world. So we're playing off of and continuing a very, very long-standing Jewish debate or conversation about what are the limits of Torah and what does Torah include. There's no doubt that part of what I'm trying to say explicitly is there is a lot of Torah from these podcasts that we need to learn. And podcasts have become not only a source of entertainment, but a source of deep learning. And deep wisdom for many of us. Part of it is also just like there's great podcasts out there that tell amazing human interest stories. Why do that work again? In other words, we don't have to replicate amazing work that's been done. We can build upon it. And so part of it is to say, yes, those things are Torah. But to get to the second part of your question, part of it is also to say Torah has to engage in and speak the language of podcasts or whatever language or stories we're speaking today. And so we have to translate the podcast into Jewish terms. And in that sense, we have to also work the other way, which is to translate those Jewish terms into podcast terms. And part of that second task, part of it's already done. That is to say, part of my quote unquote agenda or part of Padrash's effort is to say, well, there's already that possibility, right? That language is already there. Torah is already addressing these issues, Torah in a classic sense, right? And part of it is to invite some of the greatest current exponents of Torah, the translators, the people who are able to take these existent, seemingly static texts and translate them into language, into concepts that make sense to us, that are current to us, that are compelling to us.
First thing, I would like to name that right now we are a podcast that is talking about a podcast that talks about podcasts. Which is very cool. And I'm starting with that because I also think, to use a phrase I avoid like the plague, it's very Jewish. There's something about the meta commentary on the original text, which is what we're doing right now,
right,
that feels like what, at the very least, sort of traditional Jewish sources do. And I'm interested in that. The second thing I want to say is I have a particular orientation to the phrase Jewish text. And it's very important to me, and it influences just about everything I do and the kinds of texts I learn with people. I also have chavrutas, study partners, where I learn various things. With those study partners, I've actually I have one chavruta where we actually are learning sort of a traditional Jewish source. With my others, and I have multiple others, we're specifically exploring texts that are, at least in any official sense, not Jewish texts. And the reason for that is that I don't think Jewish text as a phrase is particularly useful as sort of the set of texts that are recognized by rabbinic tradition or by Jewish tradition. Like that's not how I see Jewish text. For me, any text, and that includes podcasts, that includes a TV show, that includes a modern work of fiction, like any text is a Jewish text in potential. Which is to say and I really mean any. Find your nearest like food product that has a little description of it on the side. Like truly, any text in the world, I think could be read through Jewish lenses. And I believe wisdom and even Torah could be gleaned from it if a person or a few people decide to. And I think the second that's your orientation, and you think that Jewish text is something we create, like we take things, whether they're secular, quote unquote, or Jewish, and us reading them and applying various lenses to them is the Jewish act. Like the second you think that's the project and not, oh, Jewish text is a certain corner of the bookstore that includes, Torah texts and Talmud and the set of texts that like have the stamp of approval, the hechsher, the stamp of kosherness from our tradition. That has a huge influence on how we would go about like doing Jewish. So my question to you is like, is that your approach? That what makes a text Jewish is the fact that Jews sort of engage with it or apply Jewish lenses? Or is it different and like you're choosing consciously like a particular set of podcasts that you engage with because they like uniquely allow for an illumination through Jewish lenses of whatever ideas you're trying to look at? Like I'm sort of couching it on both sides. Like, is it that any podcast out there could be engaged with on Padrash, or do you actually think that there's really sort of a subset in the world that are uniquely well suited for this kind of thing?
Regarding your first point that we're now a podcast right now, we're recording a podcast that's discussing a podcast that discusses podcasts, and that being Jewish. So yeah, in that sense, we are an interpretive community. And what that means, I think, is two things. Number one, it means that there is a sense that we have of the sacredness of the text at the beginning. And so in that sense, I think that what we're doing right now is very Jewish. It's to say these words matter. And they matter so much that we're not going to let them just drop. We're going to hold them. And you don't just hold words, you massage them. You make them intelligible. You make them intelligible to yourself. You make them intelligible to the person that you're talking with. You translate them. You help them cross boundaries, cultural boundaries. You help them cross boundaries of time so that old words can continue to resonate. So in that sense, I would say, yes, it is very Jewish. Now, the question of a closed canon or an open canon, a closed Torah or an open Torah. In that sense, as I said in response to Dan's question, I think that all I can say is that I'm very much of the school, and great work has been done by scholars like Moshe Halbertal or Jay Harris, who make it very, very clear that really, if we want to be honest and look at Torah over the ages, Torah has been a constantly evolving set of texts, which is kind of amoeba-like, right? Where certain things are ingested, integrated, translated, and achieve canonical status. Now, what are we going to continue to count as Torah? Is it speaking Hebrew? Is it speaking some holy language? And those are all I can say is those are all ongoing questions. What I would say is that what makes something Torah has everything to do with whether it's getting at some very, very essential human question. And then it demands of us. It demands of us a response. It demands of our attention. It demands interpretation. We can't dismiss it. If it's that kind of text, I would say that it's either Torah or very closely related to Torah, or ought to be somehow integrated into our Torah. I will say this, and this is something that I talked about with y'all last time that you were so kind as to have me here, which is that the rabbis invented this thing called oral Torah. When they invented oral Torah, it wasn't written down. And as such, it was very fluid and evolving and continuous. And then, of course, as we all know, the oral Torah eventually got written down. And then there's a problem of things becoming static. This is why I really take seriously the description or a description of Padrash as oral Torah, is that there's something holy and even liberating in the idea that what's happening right now, what's transpiring right now between us is wholly conversation, and that conversation is Torah.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the chapter in Proverbs that talks about, look at the ant and understand its ways. And, the idea is to really look at nature. And there's certain things that you can understand just by being a person in the world who's aware. Now, I'm conscious that I got that out of a book, the book of Proverbs. But B, I'm also conscious of the fact that I think of that particular line because it plays a role in a famous Israeli song called Yoya, which is all about kind of intentionally or unintentionally misunderstanding various Jewish texts, but in ways that are also kind of profound. But for me, it's like when one of the questions that I have when I think about your podcast and the structure of your podcast is the idea that there's a certain Jewish lens. And maybe that Jewish lens comes from text. Maybe it comes from other than text. Maybe it comes from both. But actually, I think that's an important question because, frankly, even though I myself in my teaching life am profoundly a text teacher, I think it's the only thing that I really am good at teaching. But I don't think it's actually the most important thing because I feel like one possibility is that there's a Jewish lens and that Jewish lens is derived from somewhere. And we bring that Jewish lens to looking at anything else. And the most important thing, the thing that distinguishes Jews from non-Jews, let's say, is that we bring this Jewish lens to look at various things. And then the question becomes, where does that lens come from? And one could argue that lens comes from spending a lot of time learning texts and learning ideas, or one could say, no, that lens actually comes from being raised in a certain way. And, people on surveys who say the most important thing in the world is to have a sense of humor, Jewishly. That doesn't come from text, even though I think there's a lot more humor in text than people realize, but they don't know that. So therefore, they're not getting their sense of humor from text. They're getting their sense of humor from a certain Jewish milieu. So at the end of the day, what is really the Jewish lens? I mean, that's one question. But the other question is where do we seek wisdom? And is the particularly Jewish way to seek wisdom from particularly Jewish texts? Or is the Jewish way to be oriented in the world so that we believe that wisdom comes from everywhere? And so the wisdom of the ant or the wisdom of the podcast or the wisdom that comes from the Jewish text are all equally valuable.
So it is true that those of us who are deeply engaged in Jewish texts run the risk of being self-serving when we try to make the text so central to Jewish life. That's for sure. What I would say is the question of what I'm turning to learn from, right? So you quoted Proverbs, but the same point exactly is raised by the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin, where Rabbi Yochanan says, if the Torah hadn't been given, we would be able to learn laws of humility and modesty from the cat, and we would be able to learn laws of theft from the ant, and so on and so forth. And I think that he's raising exactly the question that you are raising, which is to say, what do I need Torah for if I can look at the world, if I can look at a cat or an ant and learn things, not just things, but like real patterns, aspirations of how I should be living my life, right? An aspiration of modesty, I can learn that from a cat. An aspiration of honesty or respect for another person's property, I can learn that from an ant, and so forth. And so Rabbi Yochanan is asking in a very serious way the question that you're asking. And all I can say is that I think that Gam Zo Torah, this too is Torah, which is to say, and now I'm saying that about texts, that texts too are also Torah. The written text is there, and it is a source of value, and it is a source of consciousness for us, and it gives us vocabulary, and it gives us a framework for understanding our interactions with the world. And so that too is Torah. And it has a staying power that often eludes the immediate experience of the interaction with the cat, right? So part of what texts do, a good text do, is they shape our consciousness because they affect our habits of attention. We now notice things that we didn't notice before. If a Jewish text, classic Jewish text, right, gives us now a language for thinking about something, then that somehow affects our experience of it and can alter the aspirations and the conclusions that we draw from that experience. So that too should have a staying power and should have a voice and should have a place around the table. Now, the final thing that I'll say is Jewish texts always, always, always require and invite teachers, people who are able to help us make sense of that text. And those people, I think, are a very significant part of this conversation. So in that sense, my invitation to guests on Padrash is say, help us walk through the rain, help us figure out what the texts are telling us, help us figure out what the podcast is telling us, help us figure out how to kind of live out these values that themselves might be eternal, but it's not at all clear how I need to be applying them in the here and now.
I'm really enjoying the threads around how we define Jewish text, or maybe how we don't define Jewish text. And I want to consider a listener out there or somebody who could hear about your podcast and be like, wow, what an innovative thing to take these non-Jewish source materials, podcasts that do not think of themselves as Jewish, that frequently are not hosted by Jews, and that you are then layering onto Jewish experience. They could look at that and say, wow, what a cool new thing. And one thing we love doing on our podcast is taking stuff people think is deeply old and showing them that it's actually much newer. We do that with a lot of Jewish rituals. But I also occasionally like to talk about how certain things that may feel really new are actually quite old. And so I want to actually argue that what you're doing, not only is there precedent for it in Jewish tradition, it very much is Jewish tradition to blur the lines, blur the boundaries between quote unquote secular material and Jewish material. I'd go all the way back to one of the first stories in the Torah, and I'd bring up Noah's Ark, which is very clearly a set of people who were Israelites looking at the story of Gilgamesh. You could see it as a secular story, or secular is kind of a weird word to use in that context, but not a Jewish particular story, and making it a Jewish story, sort of building it into this lineage but actually it's kind of pre-Jewish because Abraham doesn't exist yet, right? And he's the first Jew, but it's in this book, Genesis, and it is sort of connecting the creation story to the generations that would be called Jews. That's what the Noah's Ark story does. Then you've got the Talmud itself, which sort of is in certain senses, people see it as the paradigmatic, particularly Jewish text. But we had, Burton Visotsky on this show, and he talked all about how Stoic philosophy is all over the Talmud. It's basically if you took Stoicism and mapped it onto Torah texts and etc. And we could go down the list. And there's Philo, who is this famous figure who he sort of blended Greek philosophy consciously with the Torah and read the Torah through the lens. He sort of existed to try and argue that Greek philosophy and Torah are not in conflict, but actually sort of work fully together. I'm curious whether you see yourselves in that kind of lineage. Do you see what you're doing with this show as building on a tradition of kind of conscious blurring between what might be termed secular or, surrounding cultures and Jewish material? Or have you tried to be doing something that might feel new or unprecedented?
As my first therapist said, yes. I think that at some level, we're doing what Jews in the Jewish tradition have always been doing, right? And so in that sense, we're just continuing on. And you quoted Philo in Greek philosophy. We can, jump to the Middle Ages and look at Maimonides and his attempt to, in the Guide to the Perplexed, and in fact his entire, in a certain level, the entirety of what he did, but to try to make neo-Aristotelian philosophy work with Judaism, right? So there's this ongoing sense that there's truth and Torah, and they cannot be two separate realms. We're new only because we're now, which is to say we need to translate it into our terms. We spend most of our time talking about the podcast itself that we're drashing, that we're expounding upon. But then there's also the hypertext segment, that third segment of the program that I mentioned, where I bring someone who's bringing in some professional slant, which is at all related to any traditional sense of Torah. Sometimes it's a composer. Sometimes it's a visual artist. Sometimes it's a therapist. Sometimes it's a journalist. It's people who are bringing different tools of the trade and they bring it to bear on the same questions. How do I issue an apology? What is it to think that someone can change? What is it to help someone have a sense of viewing themselves from the outside? What is it to be authentic in my workplace? All of those same questions that we were asking, I now want to learn the Torah, so to speak, of someone who's been trained as a consummate professional in some other seemingly theoretically not Jewish realm, and to view what they're having to teach us as a source of wisdom that we would be wise and quote unquote Jewish to learn from. The only thing that I would say is, and this might just be my personal disposition, but I'm always a little bit wary of being too relevant. I'm always a little bit wary of being too in step with the times. And maybe that's only me, or maybe there's a part of me that thinks that there's an aspiration of the Torah to be very, very rooted in the here and now, and at the other level, touch some aspects of our world or of existence that are transcendent, that are not circumscribed to the here and now. And so I'm a little bit wary when I'm engaging in Torah, in being too current, in being too relevant. There's a part of me that wants to say, oh no, but I don't want to be too popular, right? The minute that deconstructionists start saying, and people of contemporary literary theory say, wow, the Talmud, that's the greatest, it's intertextual and this and that and the other. I say, well, wait, let's just stop for a second. It's not just that, right? There's something else going on too. So I want to answer your very good question, Lex, with an affirmation, but also I want to say that I don't want to get lost in being too popular or too current or too relevant.
I actually wanted to stay on that subject of what you call the hypertext for a moment. These are the people that you have on who are not coming from a Jewish scholarly realm, but they're really bringing the experience, the wisdom of their experience to the text, which is the podcast that you're talking about. And I'm kind of wondering whether, in some sense, what you call the hypertext is actually potentially, and I'm not talking so much about your podcast, but about what your podcast might advise for your Beit Midrash that you run, to sort of bring in that wisdom in a more powerful and profound and like constant way. And is that something that you have been thinking about, have been engaged with outside of the context of the podcast?
There was a very, for me, tender moment when I received my ordination from Rabbi Hartman of blessed memory. So I remember I went back, I live in Jerusalem, but I'm originally from Houston. And that summer I was back in Houston, and I wanted to say thank you I of course said thank you to my parents. They were there when I received the ordination, but I wanted to say thank you. I'm the youngest of 5 brothers. And I wanted to say thank you to each of them because I feel like they are really significant teachers for me. And each of them, one of them actually, my oldest brother, David, who's a professor of law and defends people on death row, and he lives in Texas, so he has a lot to do. So I interviewed him in one of the hypertext segments of season 1. Another one of my brothers is a poet. Another one of my brothers does advocacy work for people of low income. And another one of my brothers runs a Jewish school. And I really felt, I really felt like they're out there in the world doing things, and I'm in the Beit Midrash, and I'm a couple of degrees removed from intense engagement in the world. And I as a person, and my Torah is that much more attenuated and weaker as a result of that. It was a moment when I was expressing my thanks and my incredible admiration and my sense of indebtedness to them as not just my loving brothers, but also teachers, but also an awareness of, and my Torah would be so much richer if I had some of those tools and some of that understanding and some of that ability. For as long as I've learned Torah, I mean, I started my learning perhaps with secular philosophy, but once I moved to Torah, I have always felt that the most significant moment is leaving the Beit Midrash. Torah teachers are only as good as their ability to have their Torah somehow receive expression in real action outside of the Beit Midrash. Part of that also means learning from real practitioners and not thinking that somehow the Torah ends. Okay, we've learned what there is to learn. Now let's leave the Beit Midrash and teach it. No, I talked with someone by the name of Scott Siff, who's a consultant and he's an advisor to a lot of really high profile figures, some companies and some politicians who make major screw ups and then have to figure out what to do, how to issue an apology. And so I wanted to say, let me understand, teach me what it is when you come and you help them figure out how to apologize. And you're using the best of modern tools. And if I'm not willing to turn to him or someone like him and say, teach me what it is to issue an apology that hits home, or if I'm not willing to turn to, in one of this season's conversations, I speak to composer and conductor John Axelrod, and I say, what is it to play a piece of music authentically? And if I don't understand what it is to work at authenticity and commitment, both to where I am and to what my work or this piece is demanding of me, then I've missed out on an entire piece of human learning and wisdom and closed myself in on the Beit Midrash. So as both of you know, I teach at Kolot, where we work with people in Israel, where we work with people who are doers outside of the Beit Midrash. And at one level, we're trying to teach them. And at another level, we are assuming that they have a lot to teach us, and that the Torah that is emergent from the meeting point of quote unquote, their practices, their best practices, and the wisdom or sources of wisdom that Torah has to offer, traditional Torah has to offer. That's a kind of emergent and evolving Torah. When I prepare an episode of Padrash, almost always when I'm composing my kind of ending monologue, where I try to bring a bunch of things together, almost always, episode after episode, it's the hypertext segment that sends me spinning, that sends me into some trajectory that was unanticipated for me in advance, and that is almost always very significant to me, and I would say nurturing and challenging all at the same time.
So I'm wondering, to take that thinking even broader, like you did with the concept of halacha, which is often translated Jewish law, you translate it as the going, as a path, as an evolving path. I'm also thinking about that in terms of Torah. So when we think of you talked earlier about the oral Torah. My understanding is basically for hundreds of years, people were having these oral conversations in the study halls. And at some point, for some reason, nobody's sure exactly why it got written down. And for good and for bad, it got written down. And then it kind of stayed within the realm of the experts, so to speak, for 1,000 years. And now what we're seeing is this kind of expansion of the conversation again, like you're describing, and whether maybe the podcast is a medium, not necessarily your podcast right now, but maybe the podcast as a medium is a way of having these big conversations more broadly. So in a sense, it's the reintroduction of oral Torah, quite literally, bringing into the conversation people from all walks of life. And so it's to sort of de-emphasize the expertise of the folks who were the main experts and really the only people doing it for 1,000 years. And now it's a re-expansion. Everybody's invited into this conversation. Maybe it'll get written down one day again in a few hundred years. Maybe it won't. But maybe it doesn't need to, because maybe the technology has now allowed us to have the thing that we couldn't have kept forever back then, which was what it really is all about, what Torah really is, which is not some frozen text. It's right. This conversation with people bringing their wisdom from all different sources.
Yeah. So again, the minute you asked that question, I was thrown into a scene. I kept in my mind going back to this beautiful, beautiful moment that I had. And I was teaching remotely a group in San Francisco. And we decided to do a series. It was an ongoing class. And we decided to do a series around the episodes. The structure of my classes was, you have to listen to the podcast in advance and just come with a question or comment. And then I would listen to the question or comments at the beginning. And then the main point, the main structure or the main focus of our study session was then to look at the text, the classical Jewish text that had been brought, and go in depth in that way. There was one point when I would start by asking them to share their comments or questions. And at the end of that round of their sharing their comments or questions, I literally had no desire to touch the text. I felt, and I'm being serious, I felt like Torah had been taught and spoken, and anything else, not only was it not commentary, it was going to be a letdown. It was going to be a lower level of intensity, of holiness, of urgency. And so I said, listen, I mean, we still have 45 minutes left. I don't feel right hitting the end button on our Zoom call right now. But really, I have to tell y'all that I think that what just happened was Torah, and that anything else that's happening right now is not going to hold a candle to what just happened. And what was happening at that moment, or in those moments when they were sharing, was exactly what you're describing, Dan, which is people weaving together what they had heard. Some of people were talking about the story that they had heard in the podcast, and some of them were bringing a story of their own, and some of them were relating to a point in the text, and some of them were quoting something that the rabbi had said, and some of them were and there were all of these different levels happening. It was powerful. And so in a certain sense, getting back to the beginning of your question, I think that part of the power of oral Torah is the fact that it is time bound. And so often we are so scared by the ephemeral nature of these moments, right? We have a moment, a very powerful, beautiful moment. And so what do? We reach for our camera, right? Our phone. Why? Because this moment, we know to identify this moment is powerful right now. And so we don't want it to end. But of course, really what we need to do is let it end. It was a powerful moment, and we are blessed to have been in the presence of and participated in that moment, and now it's gone. And that's part of, I think, the fierceness, the power of oral Torah. And I think that the rabbis understood that. And you're right, they did decide to write it down, quote unquote. I think that they wrote it down because they were afraid, in a certain sense, just like we're afraid of these moments being lost. They were afraid of those moments or that wisdom being lost. And it is possible to go back to a picture and remember and to plug into that. And it is possible to go back to written down words of oral Torah and have them reverberate or provide some kind of new meaning. But it is always the case that the most powerful oral Torah is unparalleled in its impact.
So we're arcing towards the close of the episode, and there was a brief moment that I want to return to as we do. You mentioned your brothers. You either said one of 5 brothers or you have 5 brothers.
One of 5. I'm the baby of 5. I've got 4 older brothers.
Okay, so you have 4. And you mentioned that they've been important teachers for you and that you had at least one of them on your show. And I want to say, I'm sure your brothers are truly wonderful teachers. I also think that there is a wisdom at play in recognizing that no matter who you are in life, like people around you have Torah.
Yes.
Like people, like your family members, your loved ones. And by the way, I would say whether they're Jewish or not, like there's people that have Torah, that have deep, deep wisdom and teaching that they not only can bring, but already are bringing. And in the same way I said before, like what makes a Jewish text isn't the text itself. Right. It's like how you read it. What makes a person a rabbi or a rebbe is not like necessarily their inherent ordination or wisdom. It's that you are looking at them and figuring out what you have, how they've rabbied you, how they've rebbied you. And so I want to celebrate that little learning of yours that you brought really briefly. And I want to connect it to something that I think is just really important about your show and its structure as a closing note, which is you have a reserved portion of every episode where non-rabbis contribute. And that is not every Jewish podcast or space or text. We have a lot of Jewish texts where the only people talking are rabbis. And we've talked on the show 100 times about how not being a rabbi, it's not that rabbis are bad, I am one, but not being a rabbi, which is to say being something else as one's job, of necessity means that you are immersed deeply in many hours of your day in something that isn't just sort of the Jewish realm, and that you can then be uniquely skilled at mapping whatever realm you do work in onto Judaism in a way that a rabbi can't, because the rabbi doesn't have that. I mean, look, rabbis are not only living in Jew zone, but like it's different when you're a rabbi who is so in those texts and not with 40 hours of their week or 60 hours of their week immersed in somewhere else. So just as a closing note, I wanted to ask you, I guess partially why you made that decision, but less why that's the structure and more like what has been your own learning process being a rabbi and inhabiting a space where you are actually the learner, learning from folks who are not rabbis a lot of the time.
Regarding the issue of expertise, what I would say is as follows. When someone comes to issue, someone who considers him or herself an expert in Jewish law, comes to issue some kind of ruling, he or she has to know the details of that particular aspect of life that they're coming to talk about. So if you're trying to come and say, how should we help a mourner deal with the loss of such and such, we need the full knowledge in Torah of emotional well-being that might be from psychology, it might be from different disciplines, but we need that in order to understand what the halakha, what the Torah is teaching us to do there. If we want to learn what it is to, let's say if we're more traditional and we want to only use a certain kind of electrical appliance, if it's doing this or that, the person who's issuing the ruling isn't an electrician who understands circuitry. And so they're going to need to consult expertise, and they're not going to have time to acquire it all. If you have a sense of Torah, as Torat Chaim is the Torah of life, so we've only got 24 hours in a day. And as my wife says, I really need to try to sleep more than 5 hours of them. And so we're down on time. And so I can't learn everything. In order to even do my job well as an interlocutor of the Jewish tradition, the textual tradition, then I have to be willing to learn the tremendous amounts of things I don't know, I don't have expertise in, from people who have spent their lives cultivating mastery in these very, very vital areas of the human experience. And so that just seems to me an amazing invitation. I mean, it's clear to me I have a lot to learn from a college counselor about what it is to help shepherd a 16 or 17-year-old through serious decisions as they come into adulthood. I have a lot to learn from someone who helps people deal with body image in terms of understanding what it is for a person to accept themselves or to see themselves through their own eyes and not through the eyes of someone else, and so on and so forth. It just seems obvious to me that there are so many people to learn from, and that if I cut myself off, I myself and the Torah also are that much poorer as a result.
Thank you so much, Leon Wiener-Dow, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Lex and Dan, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure. Keep doing the great work that y'all are doing.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Before we close out, we want to remind you, encourage you, plead with you to subscribe to Podrash. Podrash, that's Poddrash. That's Leon Wiener-Dow's amazing podcast that we spoke about today. You can check it out on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. Definitely give that a subscribe. Listen to his episodes coming up in the future. And we want to close out our podcast episode today in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook or Twitter or Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. Third, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. And the last way you can be in touch with us, although this is not quite being in touch with us, it's supporting us, is to send a donation. You can do that via JudaismUnbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.